The stars were dying, and so was hope. For the Exilari, a proud and ancient race that once ruled 5 powerful systems, the end was no longer a distant threat. It was a shadow that had finally reached their doorstep. Their twin suns, which had burned bright for thousands of years, were now unstable, collapsing from within, sending deadly waves of radiation across their planets. Once full of life and thriving cities, now their worlds were either frozen or scorched, with only underground shelters keeping a small portion of their population alive. The Exilari Council, made up of old, wise leaders, had exhausted every option. They had begged for help from their neighbors, pleaded with ancient alliances, even offered what little technology and resources they had left. But the galaxy, cruel in its politics and fearful of wasting resources, turned its back. Help did not come. Empires were too busy fighting each other, and others believed the Exilari were doomed anyway, not worth the risk. With every passing cycle, more cities collapsed, more people died, and more stars faded from their skies. The Exilari knew they were running out of time. Their scientists warned that they had less than 2 standard years before total destruction. In desperation, the council gathered one last time in a silent chamber beneath the ground. There were no debates, no arguments. Only one question: who else could they ask? The answer was unthinkable to many. A young species, new to space travel, barely accepted into the Galactic Council, a race known more for their unpredictable nature than diplomacy. The humans. Many Exilari elders shook their heads, calling it madness. Humans were still seen as primitive by some, emotional and reckless. But others argued that perhaps it was that very nature that made them different, that made them capable of something the rest of the galaxy had forgotten: compassion. And so, with trembling hands and heavy hearts, they prepared the final message. It was not a demand, not a bargain, just a simple, honest plea. They shared their story, their history, and their desperation. They opened their souls to a species they barely knew, hoping that somewhere on a distant blue planet, someone would listen. The transmission was sent from deep beneath the crust of Exilor Prime, using the last functioning long-range beacon they had. The message crossed light years of empty space, flying past silent stars and cold worlds, until it reached the human relay station near the edge of their territory. And then there was silence. The Exilari waited. Days passed, then weeks. Other races mocked them, saying humans would never respond. Some even laughed, calling it a waste of time. But deep underground, the Exilari still watched the stars, hoping for even a single word in return. Still, nothing came. Their systems continued to decay. More families vanished. Their once great libraries collapsed under the weight of time and neglect. Some began to lose faith. Whispers grew perhaps the humans had ignored them like everyone else. Perhaps this was truly the end. But what the Exilari didn't know was that Earth had heard them, loud and clear. And while the galaxy thought humans were doing nothing, Earth was moving in silence. Their scientists had studied the data with deep concern, realizing the situation was far worse than even the Exilari believed. Their engineers had started designs, working day and night in secret facilities to create solutions that no other species had dared to try. Their leaders had met behind closed doors, away from curious eyes, to decide what kind of future they wanted to be remembered for. There were no speeches, no grand announcements to the stars. Humanity didn't want applause, they wanted to act. Across Earth and its colonies, quiet preparations began. Ships were upgraded, cargo bays filled, emergency response teams trained. Artificial suns were tested in lunar orbits, and machines were built that could reverse atmospheric collapse. The humans didn't respond with words. They responded with action. But still, the Exilari didn't know this. All they had was silence, and as their sun began to flicker for the last time, they gathered in the great dome of remembrance. Children sat beside the old, listening to the last stories of their culture. Their musicians played songs that hadn't been heard in centuries. It was not just an end of life, it was an end of meaning. And then, just as the night seemed endless, the stars shifted. Bright streaks tore across the black sky. At first, they thought it was another solar flare. But then came the sound, deep, vibrating, powerful. Dozens of massive ships emerged from warp space, surrounding the Accelerate system in perfect formation. Their hulls were dark, shaped like wings and blades, humming with energy. These were not warships of conquest. These were vessels built for salvation. The humans had arrived, and they did not come to watch a funeral. They came to save a species. Earth had received the message. Hidden deep inside a human outpost floating silently near the edge of known space, the emergency transmission had flashed across the main communication screen, a desperate, unencrypted plea from a race on the brink of destruction. The Exalari, proud and once powerful, had sent their final hope to a species they barely knew. The message contained no threats, no bargaining, just the truth, a cry for help. The human officer on duty that night watched the screen in silence, feeling the weight of those trembling voices from across the stars. He didn't forward the message to the usual channels immediately. Instead, he read it again. And again. There was something different about it, something deeply human buried within the alien words fear, helplessness, and hope. Within hours, the message reached Earth. Not the news outlets or the public forums, but the private tables of global leaders and the secure servers of secret labs. While the rest of the galaxy laughed or ignored the plea, Earth went quiet, not out of ignorance, but out of focus. The silence that followed was not a delay of indifference. It was the calm before something much bigger. Inside underground bases, scientists pored over the data. The collapse of the Exalari twin suns was more violent than expected. The surrounding planets were being torn apart slowly, their atmospheres shredded, their magnetic fields broken. Any help would require more than medicine or food. It would demand rewriting the rules of survival. Engineers sketched prototypes of mobile sun stabilizers, massive machines capable of absorbing and redirecting stellar energy. Terraforming teams examined how to modify surviving moons into temporary shelters. AI models ran simulations, calculating what was needed to save not just a population, but an entire way of life. In orbit, construction drones began to assemble new modules on human fleets, modifying exploration ships into emergency response vessels. All of this was done in silence. To the rest of the galaxy, Earth appeared unmoved. The transmission was marked as received, but no reply followed. The Galactic Council took this as confirmation that humans, like everyone else, would turn their backs. Rumors spread quickly. Some said Earth was too proud to assist the collapsing race. Others whispered that humans were waiting to profit from Exalari extinction, hoping to claim abandoned planets. But behind every wall of doubt, Earth continued its quiet work. They didn't need to talk. They needed to be ready. The president of the Earth Union held a secret meeting with the heads of major space colonies. They asked only one question: if it were us, would we want help? The answer was unanimous. Humanity had nearly destroyed itself in the past. Climate disasters, global wars, famines, and near extinction had once painted Earth in hopeless colors. It was only through unity and unexpected kindness that they had survived. Now, it was time to return that debt. Earth's greatest strength wasn't its technology or firepower. It was its memory of suffering and the lessons it carried. That is why every human hand, from the janitor in a launch bay to the scientist designing a planetary shield, worked with a quiet purpose. They remembered what it felt like to be ignored. They would not let another race suffer that same fate. Still, time was short. Reports showed that the larger of the Exalari suns would collapse into a dwarf star within weeks. The shockwave would destroy 3 planets and flood the system with radiation. The human plan was simple, but risky. A fleet would be sent with enough supplies to hold a civilization. Artificial suns would be deployed to stabilize temperatures, and deep space generators would be used to restart atmospheric growth. They couldn't stop the collapse, but they could slow it, buy the Exalari time, and give them a future. Meanwhile, humanity's best pilots were recalled from every mission. Medical teams trained for alien physiology. Psychologists studied Exalari behavior, hoping to understand how to comfort a species facing extinction. Earth prepared not just to rebuild, but to heal. And all this time, the Exalari waited in silence, believing the humans had ignored them like the rest. Inside their underground chambers, the Auxiliary Council held meetings filled with silence and sorrow. Their last cities were now tombs. Their sun flickered like a dying candle. Some began to prepare for death with quiet dignity. Darkness had already taken half the Exilari's sky as their primary sun shrank into a dying ember, casting flickering red shadows over the land. Dust storms howled across broken cities, while underground bunkers trembled under the stress of a planet slowly tearing apart. Inside these shelters, the Exilari people huddled together, waiting not for salvation, but for the final collapse. They had long stopped expecting any answer to their plea. The humans had not responded, not a word, not a signal, not even a rejection. The silence had grown heavier with each passing hour, making the idea of survival feel more like a dream than a possibility. But then, something strange happened. One of the outer defense satellites picked up movement. Not a single ship, not a scout, but an entire fleet, dozens of vessels breaking out of warp space right at the edge of the dying system. The satellite AI ran 1,000 checks, thinking it must be a sensor error. It wasn't. Within moments, those on the surface saw something that made them forget their fear. Lights, bright and focused, cut through the choking skies like blades. Massive shadows hovered above the atmosphere. Ships like nothing the Auxiliary had ever seen. Smooth, elegant, and pulsing with controlled power. At first, the people thought it was an invasion, one final insult before the end. But these ships didn't attack. They released drones that fell like raindrops, each one carrying supplies, medicines, and mobile shelters. The skies above the largest bunker opened like a curtain, revealing the command ship, a colossal human vessel known as Hopebringer. It didn't send a warning. It sent a message. We heard you. We came. Inside the central Auxiliary chamber, silence returned, but this time it was filled with disbelief. Their leaders stared at the communication feed, watching as human engineers in exosuits landed outside their bunkers and began working without waiting for permission. They deployed solar shields that blocked deadly radiation. They set up air purifying towers to restore breathable zones. They carried water, food, and strange devices that repaired cracked buildings with energy-based scaffolding. For the first time in weeks, the Exilari stepped outside without fear. They expected heat, radiation, and chaos, but instead they saw humans standing beside them, working silently but urgently, as if their lives depended on it too. No speeches, no claims of power, no demands. Just action. The Auxiliary scientists, confused but curious, approached the humans. Instead of ignoring them, the humans handed them tablets filled with blueprints, open source, translated and editable. It was not charity. It was collaboration. A chance not only to survive, but to learn and grow together. As the second sun began to tremble, the humans deployed the real miracle artificial suns. Each one was a glowing sphere the size of a mountain, built in deep space and carried through warp corridors. They anchored them above Auxiliary colonies, lighting the skies with a golden warmth that felt alien but beautiful. The Auxiliary children laughed for the first time in days, chasing the shadows as if the nightmare had been a dream. But behind the scenes, the human commanders knew this was not a victory. It was a race against time. The sun's final collapse would send gravitational shocks across the system. Entire planets would be ripped apart. So while Earth's teams worked on the surface, their best minds prepared in orbit. They launched magnetic stabilizers that floated like massive rings around the Exilari's homeworld. These would absorb and redirect the shockwaves, delaying planetary destruction just long enough for evacuation. A backup plan was already active. Giant human ships, hollowed for colonization, stood ready to carry millions away if needed. But the hope was to save the world, not abandon it. The Exilari were stunned. Not only had humans arrived, but they came prepared with everything: answers to questions no one had asked, tools for problems that hadn't yet formed. It wasn't arrogance. It was empathy turned into action. One Auxiliary elder whispered to his daughter, "They didn't respond because they were busy saving us." That single line spread like wildfire through the bunkers and cities, giving strength to tired hands and hope to broken hearts. Still, not everyone believed in miracles. The Galactic Council watched the unfolding event with disbelief and jealousy. They had ignored the auxiliary's cry, mocking it as a foolish weakness. Now, they were watching as humans rewrote the rules of aid. No speeches, no debates, just results. Some races feared this new power. Others began to question their own choices. If humans could do this for strangers, what else were they capable of? What were they preparing for? Back on Earth, the mission directors watched the XLR system through live feeds. When the report came that the artificial suns had stabilized key colonies, they didn't celebrate, they simply nodded and began planning the next step. They weren't doing this for recognition. They were doing it because it was right. Deep inside, they remembered how it felt to be alone, begging for help, and hearing nothing but silence. They had promised never to let that happen again, not to any species, no matter how different or distant. On the surface, a young auxiliary technician approached a human pilot who had just landed. "Why?" he asked in a trembling voice. The pilot didn't answer immediately. He just looked at the alien sky half lit by artificial light, half covered by dying starlight, and said, "Because we know what it feels like to fall." That sentence would later be carved into a monument at the heart of the new XLR capital, a symbol of the day humanity arrived not with weapons, but with hands outstretched. And from that moment on, the galaxy would never look at humans the same way again. The XLR cities had begun to breathe again, not just in the physical sense, but in spirit. Light returned to darkened streets, clean air flowed through underground shelters, and the artificial suns warmed bones once frozen by fear. But as life slowly returned, so did the questions. Silent, deep questions that no language could ask properly. Why did the humans help them when no one else did? What kind of civilization could plan this much, care this much, and still ask for nothing in return? There had been no broadcast of victory, no demands for tribute, no show of superiority. The humans came, worked day and night beside aliens they had never met, saved entire colonies with strange technology, and spoke only when necessary. It wasn't silence out of arrogance. It was a different kind of conversation, one made with actions. To the XLR, it was a strange and humbling mystery. The elders tried to understand it through old tales. The scientists searched historical records. The leaders gathered their best minds and philosophers to decode the human behavior, but no answer made sense. They called out into the dark, expecting to vanish, and humanity had answered in a language made not of words, but of unshakable commitment. Even now, human ships orbited the system like silent guardians. Each day, more drones arrived. Some built structures. Some treated the sick. Some simply observed without interfering, recording data about the sun's final collapse. A quiet urgency hung in the air. Humanity knew something the XLR didn't, something about the scale of the threat. But again, they said nothing. They simply worked harder, faster, never explaining why. And that silence created more questions. One night, a young XLR child stood outside the shelter with his father. He pointed at the sky, where human ships floated like stars. "Are they gods?" he asked. The father had no answer. Even the leaders didn't. The truth was stranger than any myth. They were just people. Flesh and blood. But they moved with the certainty of something greater, like they'd already lived through this 100 times. And maybe, in their long history of struggle, they had. Some XLR began to fear them. Not out of hatred, but confusion. No species had ever helped without expecting something in return. The Galactic Council had always made deals, trades, or alliances of gain. But humans had made no demands. The Council sent a probe to observe, hoping to understand what the humans wanted. The probe never returned. Not because it was destroyed, but because humans found it and returned it, along with a short message: "Your questions are the wrong kind." No threats. No anger. Just a sentence that puzzled everyone. What were the right questions then? What were humans trying to say by doing so much, yet speaking so little? Back on Earth, the mission command monitored everything. They saw the confusion spreading among the XLR, but they didn't explain. They'd already decided that words were not enough anymore. Too many times, the universe had ignored cries for help while debating protocols. Too many lives were lost because of red tape and politics. Humanity had learned from its pain. Now they answered with deeds. Still, the Acceleri wanted to know. They sent messages asking why humans risked their own lives for a dying world. There was no reply. But the very next day, humans activated the planetary stabilizers earlier than planned. It was dangerous, ahead of schedule, but it worked. Earth's engineers suffered radiation burns, and a few even died saving the control relays. Their names were not announced. Their sacrifices were not broadcast. Only a single plaque appeared in the center of the Acceleri capital, listing the names of the fallen. No speeches, just names. The silence became even heavier, not cold, but sacred. The Acceleri Council gathered again, this time not to ask what humans wanted, but to ask what they themselves had missed all this time. Had they become so used to deals and politics that they forgot what help truly looked like? One Acceleri philosopher said softly, "They don't want anything. Maybe that is what we must learn first." And with that, something shifted. The Acceleri stopped asking with words. They started watching, learning from the humans, joining their efforts side by side. They repaired their own structures with new purpose. They taught their children the names of the humans who had died for them. They studied Earth technology not just to copy it, but to understand the thought behind it. And slowly, a new respect began to grow deep and quiet, just like the humans' arrival. But not everyone was at peace. Some council members feared this quiet power. "If they can do all this without asking," one said, "imagine what they can do when they do ask." Another added, "They may not speak loudly, but they speak clearly." Fear and admiration mixed inside their hearts. The galaxy had always feared noise-giant fleets, loud rulers, bold declarations. But now, it feared silence, the kind of silence that built, saved, and endured without needing applause. The kind that could shake the very structure of galactic politics simply by being better. Far above the Acceleri world, on the command deck of Hopebringer, a human officer watched the stars flicker. "They're still asking why," he said quietly. The captain, an older woman with tired eyes and a voice like steel, replied, "They'll understand when they stop asking with words." Then she turned away and gave the next order to begin the energy transfer that would extend the planet's life by another 30 cycles. No reward, no glory. Just one more quiet answer to a question no one could speak. The galaxy had changed, even if most of it didn't realize it yet. News of what happened in the dying Acceleri system traveled slowly, whispered through hidden channels and quiet conversations between those who paid attention. Most still believed the humans were just a rising species, strange, emotional, and unpredictable. But the few who truly observed now understood something deeper had occurred. It wasn't just that the humans had saved a dying world, or that they did it without asking for anything. It was how they did it calm, relentless, with a kind of power that did not scream but moved mountains. The council, once proud and sure of its place, began to feel a quiet unease. Their fleets, rules, and politics suddenly felt hollow when compared to the power that had rebuilt cities without boasting, sacrificed without ceremony, and responded to a final plea not with judgment, but with action. Across many systems, the meaning of strength was being redefined not by force or fear. The Acceleri were no longer just survivors. They had become witnesses to a lesson the rest of the galaxy had not yet learned. They'd seen what real power looked like not in weapons, but in the hands that lifted them when no one else did. On the surface of the Acceleri homeworld, monuments began to rise, not giant statues or symbols of war, but quiet spaces of reflection. Names were carved into stone, not just of the humans who gave their lives, but also of those who had worked beside them without question. In the capital square, a strange sculpture appeared, half human, half Acceleri, reaching toward the sun that no longer threatened to collapse. It had no title, no plaque, and yet everyone understood what it meant. Something had been born from the ashes, an idea that power was not about control, but about choice. The choice to act when you didn't have to. The choice to help when no one expected you to. That was what humans had done. And that choice had shown the galaxy a kind of courage far greater than war. Still, many leaders struggled to accept it. In distant star systems, debates began. Are the humans trying to take control through kindness? Some asked, is this just another kind of domination? Others shook their heads and replied, if it is, then we have all been doing it wrong for centuries. Old alliances began to tremble. Not because the humans had threatened them, but because their silence forced everyone else to look inward. What had they done when the Acceleri called for help? They had waited, argued, and then turned away. And now, they were being compared to the very species they once ignored. The power humans had shown was uncomfortable, not because it was dangerous, but because it revealed the weakness of everyone else. And that was the kind of power that could truly change the galaxy, not by destroying it, but by showing it another way. Back on Earth, humanity did not celebrate. There were no grand speeches or parades. The people who had worked on the mission returned to their families quietly. Some carried scars, others deep memories, but none spoke of heroism. To them, it had simply been the right thing to do. Earth's leaders reviewed the reports, checked the status of the repaired star, and approved the next support phase without fanfare. They weren't looking to lead an empire. They weren't looking to be praised. They had once been broken, nearly destroyed by their own history. But that past had taught them what it felt like to be alone, to cry for help and hear nothing in return. They had sworn never to be like the ones who ignored them. And so, when the plea came, they had answered not with weapons, but with hands extended. In time, the Acceleri sent a message back. It was not written in traditional language, but crafted using Earth's own artistic symbols, colors, sounds, and light patterns that conveyed emotion more than words. It was a message of thanks, of respect, and of deep understanding. But the last part of the message stood out. It read, "You showed us that power is not in the voice that commands, but in the hand that lifts. We will never forget." That line echoed across Earth's space agencies, passed from one terminal to another, not because it was proud or dramatic, but because it was true. Quietly, humanity realized that their greatest influence would not come from treaties or force, but from the way they made others feel when the worst had happened. As years passed, more species began to observe Earth, not with fear, but with curiosity. The question was no longer what do humans want, but what can we learn from them? The old power structures slowly began to crack. The Council, once the highest authority, now had to listen when humans spoke, even if they only said a few words. Because the galaxy had seen something new, something impossible to ignore, a civilization that wielded power like a shield instead of a sword. And that shield had protected not just themselves, but those who had no hope left. In the end, power was redefined not by weapons, armies, or political games, but by the quiet courage of a species that had once been underestimated. And as the stars burned on, the memory of that desperate message and the response that followed would live on in silence, echoing forever through the hearts of those who had learned the new meaning of power.